This video is sponsored by Many Worlds Tavern. Today I'm going to give you some advice for building combat encounters in D&D. This is a video subject that was voted on by my patrons at the Fabricate level. They get a chance to vote on a few video topics that will appear every month, and this was one of the winners. Of course, we had no idea that there was going to be a huge scandal with Wizards of the Coast in January, but despite everything going on with D&D as a published game, I know plenty of people will continue to play 5e using third-party products or homebrew or their existing books, even if they never give WotC another dime. And I'm one of them. So we're going to use 5e as a baseline for this video because it's a system I know well and I like it a lot. In the future, as I get more familiar with more games, I might make companions to this video that cover combat advice for different systems. Of course, sitting down and learning everything I can about a bunch of new systems and their styles of play, while also running my existing D&D games and making 2 videos every week, means a lot of late nights these days. And thankfully for me, I have a great supply of coffee and tea thanks to today's sponsor, Many Worlds Tavern. Many Worlds Tavern is an online coffee and tea company founded by people who just love the tabletop community. And right now it's really important to support the companies that actually care about the community and want to make a difference. Many Worlds Tavern not only makes tea and coffee that is really, really good. I'm a fan of the Sacred Spring Tea, which is a cinnamon hibiscus plum. It's so good. But they also donate $1 of each bag sold to specifically support gaming-related nonprofits, to give back to a community that means so much to all of us. Now more than ever, we really need people who will do exactly that, who will champion the community, which is the beating heart of the hobby. The first 100 of you who use the code SUPERGEEK at checkout will receive 10% off of your order. You can also get this discount by using the link in the doobly-doo below. Once again, that's code SUPERGEEK at checkout for 10% off of your order. Thank you so much to Many Worlds Tavern for sponsoring this video. Now here's the funny thing about encounter building, and we kind of need to establish this before we get into it. There is a lot of really useful advice out there, and hopefully in this video, to help you build more dramatic or dynamic or maybe even balanced encounters. But this subject isn't as simple as there being a right way to do things. Everything, even encounter design, comes down to style. There are 2 approaches to encounter building: carefully crafting balanced encounters or choosing monsters based on the situation. And neither is wrong. And you also don't have to pick just one. Your approach to encounter building lands on a spectrum between these 2 methods, and how much you value each will determine your style for encounters. Or perhaps your style and the way you run your game will help dictate where you land on the spectrum. And again, your style can always change, either over time or depending on the campaign you're running and the players in your game. And that's okay. Because none of these are right answers, you can always change your mind. We're going to talk about both approaches, but before we do, something to note. When a party of adventurers is facing off against a group of enemies, that victory is likely to go to whichever side has more members. That's not always true, but it's a useful rule of thumb. Combat encounters are team sports. If you look at a basketball game, imagine one team only had 1 athlete on the court and the other had the usual 5. Even if he's the best basketball player ever and he has special abilities that help him react more quickly and legendary resistances that help him overcome bad calls from the ref, that one player will still be at a disadvantage. Now imagine that one team has the usual 5 on the field, and the other has 10. Court, not field. Now that team of 5 is going to struggle. And also, imagine basketball players are trying to kill each other, and whenever one of them gets knocked unconscious, their side is just down an athlete indefinitely, making their odds much worse for the rest of the game. Maybe I should have used football, the sport where players are actually trying to kill each other. Now that we have laid that groundwork, let's discuss the 2 approaches to encounter design. Or perhaps a better way to think of them are as 2 guiding philosophies. First, let's talk about creating a balanced encounter. This is the approach tacitly encouraged by the game. After all, in the section in the Dungeon Master's Guide about building encounters, they give you some helpful math, represented by a useful chart. So let's get this out of the way. The chart in the Dungeon Master's Guide is bad. I'm not saying this because Wizards of the Coast is in hot water with their audience and I'm trying to pretend these books were always bad. There's a lot to like in the Dungeon Master's Guide, but we've had just over 8 years with this system, and for a long time the community has known that this chart just doesn't work. From what I can tell, everything built with this guidance winds up a little bit more dangerous, or possibly way more lethal, than the chart implies. And considering you have to do a bunch of math, adding monster XP together, multiplying it by the target goal, and then having to do it all again if the number doesn't land exactly where you wanted it, the fact that the final product doesn't even match what the chart promised means using this approach is a waste of your time. Xanathar's Guide to Everything gave us a better system. It's still not perfect, but it allows us to use the player's levels as a benchmark for determining monsters without nearly as much back and forth. But this system still has 2 issues. One, again, this lends itself really well to the impulse of adding more combatants to the enemy side, since they're such a great way to spend your encounter budget that the math gives you. And as we discussed, that makes fights exponentially more difficult. And two, this system doesn't know whether or not your players have magic items. The game couldn't decide how it wanted you to distribute magic items in the game because, if I had to guess, the playtest leading into 5th edition gave the designers no strong guidance on a unified system for magic items that everybody would be happy with. I briefly touched on magic items in another video, and honestly, the game's approach to them probably deserves a whole dedicated video in the future, but for now, we can just say that the designers didn't want to dictate how many magic items you should give your party and how often to do so, and so the math for the monsters does not account for those. I also just really briefly want to pause and highlight the fact that 4th edition had a better approach to these issues across the board. Magic items were handed out to the party regularly, and were carefully leveled to different tiers of play, and building encounters was super easy. You had an XP budget based on your player character's levels, and then each monster had a classification that dictated how they acted in combat. So you were actively given guidance on how to choose a more interesting variety of monsters that changed the strategy of the fight. I'm not going to pretend that 4E was a perfect system, or even claim that the encounter building math worked at higher levels, when I have usually heard the opposite. But at least it was more straightforward, and it gave you what it promised. If you wanted balanced encounters at low levels, there were tools for that. However, all of this is going to make it sound like I'm trying to say that you shouldn't try to build balanced encounters, and that's not my intention. Building balanced encounters can be more of a chore, but running them is usually really fun because you're cultivating a specific experience for your players. This is an approach I've shifted away from in the past few years, but it's one that I would actually like to revisit in future games, because I do think there is value in this approach for the right campaign. In fact, the players in one of my campaigns can so often handle every combat really, really easily, I'm probably going to start taking more time on my encounters in advance of the games, and maybe change my approach partway through this campaign, which, by the way, is totally allowed. You can try new techniques and change your combat encounter style whenever you want. It's totally up to you to figure out what's right for your table. Another thing I like about using a mathematical approach is how it can encourage creativity in one of two ways. Let's say you're building an encounter with a bunch of gnolls, and you do the math and you've got some room left in the budget for something relatively significant. Let's say that you can easily fit in a CR2 monster. Now, you don't want to spend that on 4 more low-level gnolls because you remember that the more monsters are in the fight, the more likely it is that it will go against the players. So you have 2 choices. One, you can look for a monster that matches what you have left over in your budget. By that I mean you can just pick something else that matches that CR. Maybe a sea hag, or a green dragon wormling, or a gibbering mouther. But why would a pack of gnolls be traveling with any of these monsters? I don't know. But that becomes an interesting question that can help add fun context to your adventure. And your answer could change radically depending on which monster you chose, and your personal sensibilities. When I pick monsters based on the situation, I so rarely stray from the different types of gnolls or goblins or whatever. And if you use this approach, you can sometimes find yourself adding things that totally change major plot points in your campaign, in ways that keep things really interesting. But let's say you don't want to do that. That's fine too. You just want a big, beefy brawler gnoll, or a gnoll that has a specific power, but you're not happy with any of the other gnoll variants, or you've already got them in the encounter, and you want something new. Well, maybe you just take another CR2 monster, like a berserker or a minotaur skeleton, and reskin it and call it a gnoll. Or maybe you can just build a new monster using the monster building advice in the back of the Dungeon Master's Guide, or using other advice from other sources online. This is also a really fun, interesting process, and when you do it, you're learning a lot about game design, and that makes you a stronger DM. However, there is another issue about balanced encounters that is worth examining, which is, I think it's really tempting to forget to have your enemies act like real creatures. I can't speak to whether everyone has this issue, but I know that if I have a bunch of carefully designed encounters, I don't want my monsters to retreat to the next room, because it upsets the balance of this fight and the next fight. But when monsters don't retreat when they're losing, or to go and get reinforcements, they don't act like the inhabitants of a real, living world. And that's important. You also don't want a string of deadly encounters all in a row, so building encounters like this is a really useful tool, but one to be used in moderation. Not every fight needs to be deadly, because any fight still serves the purpose of making your players spend resources. As long as you can find other ways to make these smaller fights dramatic and interesting in other ways, your players won't notice that's what you're doing. I also want to highlight Mike Shea from the Sly Flourish channel and blog, who has an even simpler mathematical approach to encounter design. Any encounter may be deadly if the sum total of monster challenge ratings is greater than 1/4 of the sum of total character levels, or half the sum total of character levels if the characters are above 4th level. This approach still requires a bit of math, but I trust Mike Shea to give us useful data. He thinks a lot about monsters and encounters and creating interesting challenges for his players. And he specifies this should be used as a ceiling, specifically to create deadly encounters. If you don't want a deadly encounter, just scale back on this a bit. But of course, he also strongly encourages you to pick monsters based on the situation in the game. So let's tackle that approach. It might just make much more sense to you to have the creatures determined by the story. You don't like the idea that the monsters the heroes cross paths with will automatically be appropriate level for the party to face. Instead, you just want to determine the monsters in an area, and then let the players decide how they want to interact with them, and more importantly, whether they want to interact with them at all. There's absolutely a virtue to this, and I think it works really well with an approach to story design that I personally tend to favor. You try to figure out what would happen if the player characters never showed up. What would happen if they weren't there? This allows you to think a little bit more about what these monsters want, and that helps you determine where they'd be in the dungeon, what they're doing, and how many of them there are. Again, I'm going to point to a Sly Flourish article about this approach. The link is in the doobly-doo. However, if you're going to use the story and not the levels as a guide for building your encounters, signposting becomes really important. By that I mean making sure there are clear indicators that give the players a chance to figure out what kind of monsters are ahead of them, and if they want, they can turn back. For example, if I tell you that you enter a dungeon area with a bunch of broken mirrors where all the glass was ground up into basically sand, and then the next room has a bunch of statues of adventurers caught in a frozen scream, their hands moving toward their eyes and yet unable to block their gaze, and then I say that you hear a bunch of snakes hissing in the next room along with a woman's voice singing softly, do you know what kind of monster might be in the next room? I bet you do. What about a cave room where bones have been stripped clean, and then another cave room where demonic words have been scratched into the walls with bloody fingernails, and from the room beyond that you can hear harsh voices chanting in a language that makes your blood run cold, and some sort of howling, shrieking sound getting louder. You might not know exactly what's in there yet, but you have things to interact with to give you clues. Survival checks to see what killed the creatures and stripped away the meat from their bones. Arcana or religion or history checks on the demonic words on the wall, or on the words being chanted. Maybe a nature check to see if the howling, shrieking sound is a natural creature or something else, something more alien. And honestly, this doesn't even include whether or not there are any gnolls keeping watch outside or hanging out in the early chambers, or any prisoners chained up in a side passage, all of which can be sources of even more information. Signposting is a useful technique for balanced encounters as well, but it's especially important when you don't spend a lot of time worrying in advance about whether or not an encounter is balanced. Signposting is the only thing that gives the players an opportunity to retreat prior to coming into contact with something that they are not prepared for. And that's vital because this approach lends itself really well to an open-world, sandbox-style story, and the ability to retreat, regroup, reassess, and maybe even level up in return is one of the hallmarks of that style of play. And it's usually the only thing standing between a party and a TPK. Once again, these approaches aren't incompatible, and how much you use each method depends on your group, your campaign, and where you are in your personal GM journey. And of course, it depends what system you're using. But while I'm sure the exact math will depend a lot on the game that you're playing, these general approaches will offer a lot of value no matter what system you play. Thank you so much for watching. I look forward to your thoughts in the comments below. This is a rich subject with a lot of different aspects, so let me know if there's anything else about the subject of combat encounters that you would like me to discuss in future videos. If you want to support this channel, there are a few ways you can do so. You can subscribe and ring the bell to get notified about new videos as soon as they come out. I post new videos every Monday and Thursday. You can support me financially on Patreon. Truly, I do not care about the dollar amount. Even if you can only support at $1 per month, that would mean so much to me. You can join my Discord community and hang out with other nerds. People talk about every video when it comes out, and there's always a bunch of new perspectives that really help people examine these topics from other angles in a way that I just can't from my limited perspective. So if you want more information about this subject right away, especially if you want to talk to people about something specific that I said in this video, then the Discord is the best place to do so. And the fourth way you can support the channel is by signing up for my newsletter, where I will send occasional updates about, life and stuff. Since we talked a lot about balance in this video, you should check out my recent video about what balance means in D&D and what we mean when we call something game-breaking. Thank you again for watching, and until next time, play fair and have fun.